Hi everyone, I am Erin Beckwell and I'm going to go through a bit of an overview of trauma-informed care. And so this session won't train you in trauma-informed techniques specifically. I'll talk about some examples, but it's really giving the foundation for understanding the principles of trauma-informed care and how those can be used in practice in a variety of ways to reduce barriers to care and promote resilience in the folks that we work with. So this won't make you an expert in trauma, and that's one of the most crucial pieces of understanding trauma-informed care is that it isn't trauma specialist training and it's not trauma-specific care. So this isn't about how do we work with trauma survivors on their trauma. This is an approach that can be applied to everyone we work with. They can also be applied to ourselves, out in our personal lives, in our workplaces, and it's a very sort of broad-based approach. And so it gives us a bit of information about trauma, how it impacts people in their relationships, and then provides some guidance as to how we can adapt our approach to reflect an understanding of the impacts of trauma on folks, but again, not specifically addressing the trauma, and in fact, that's actively discouraged in a trauma-informed model. So just to get us started, a basic understanding of trauma. And so one of the things that's really fascinating is that our society has a really narrow view of what counts as trauma. And so when you think about trauma, most people have very specific types of experiences in mind. So they're thinking about abuse and neglect, perhaps a traumatic event, and certainly those things do count as trauma, but trauma isn't really about what happens. It's about what happens after that happens in somebody's brain, in their body. And so trauma can be any event, series of events, set of circumstances which are experienced as by the person experiencing them. So they could be experienced as physically harmful, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening, or all three. And so when you think about this, someone who's also experiencing the same event, perhaps another family member, someone who's maybe witnessed the event, a bystander or observer, may have a very different perspective on whether an experience was indeed traumatic. And so they may have not had the same experience internally and not interpreted that event as potentially or actually harmful in some way or life-threatening. And so it's really important to understand that trauma is highly subjective and people do not have control and choice over how their body interprets experiences. And so we are talking about core primal experiences where our bodies and brains go into sort of autopilot mode. And so they're in survival mode because they are interpreting something happening as being potentially actually harmful or life-threatening. And so what happens then after that is really where things get quite interesting. And so these experiences, which are interpreted as potentially or actually harmful or life-threatening, can have lasting adverse effects on a variety of areas of human functioning. And so we see basic functioning, people's capacity to regulate their bodily functions, sleep, eat, just sort of basic functionings, but then we also see some very profound effects often on things like mental well-being, emotional well-being. This can show up in terms of physical effects, certainly relationally or socially, and spiritually as well. And so it's really important to understand, though, that the profile of what trauma will impact looks different from person to person and can change throughout the lifetime. And so if it's affecting one area initially, it may actually continue to affect that and then affect other things down the road. But you can also see things kind of bounce around a bit in terms of effect. And so people may find that very frustrating, where they may have physical symptoms in particular settings. They may have more mental health issues in some settings or contexts or time periods, and so on. And so trauma isn't what happened to you, it's what happened inside you. And so that sort of distinction is really, really critical, because often people have experienced events that aren't part of that classic trauma profile, not abuse and neglect, not really traumatizing events, those types of things. Their experience of trauma is rooted in a life experience that's maybe an ongoing experience. Maybe it's attachment-oriented trauma that happened when they were an infant or a toddler, that was very subtle, difficult to see, maybe didn't meet the child and family services threshold for neglect, but certainly had an impact on them. That can be very frustrating and challenging to understand, particularly when siblings and others who've had a similar experience may not have the same effects, may not actually perceive or understand their experience to be trauma at all. So you reach this point where people start questioning whether what they've experienced is indeed trauma, whether the effects of that is actually valid and legitimate. And certainly there's a lot of messaging in folks' lives often around, let it go, it was in the past, move on. There may be commentary about things like attention seeking, and this doesn't just come from, people in someone's personal life. Often folks hear this from professionals, and that is really, really damaging, because one of the greatest sort of buffers against the long-term effects of trauma is having a compassionate, validating witness. And so at some point, people need to hear from someone they trust, someone they believe, someone that they can see really gets what happened, that yes, that was actually a valid experience that resulted in this thing you're experiencing now, or these things you're experiencing now. And so if people can't get that, it's really, really challenging to engage in healing from trauma. So anything that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope can be experienced as trauma. And that certainly is a broader definition than what most people are used to working with. People who hear that are often like, so anything could be traumatizing? In some ways, yes. It really depends on that individual's capacity. And so if people have good coping skills, they're less likely to actually experience long-term trauma effects. If they have good social support, good, compassionate, present people in their lives who are able to acknowledge what has happened, who provide support in an appropriate way, they're less likely to experience those enduring adverse effects of trauma. And certainly, though, so this is an internal and an external thing. So if people have minimal capacity, not good support, no one to actually bear witness to their pain and suffering and validate that experience, it is quite likely that they will develop some long-term adverse effects, but again, can look very, very different from person to person. So trauma can come from a range of things, and certainly in areas of practice like mental health, we see people who have had often multiple of these experiences. One of the things I'll point out to you on this slide, though, is that right at the center, medical procedures and healthcare experiences. And so one thing I need people to hear is that the system in which we work, so who work in healthcare, which most of us do, often is a source of harm and trauma for people. We like to think that everybody in our system goes to work every day to do good work. Nobody comes to work to cause harm. That said, harm is caused. And so people can experience trauma from medical procedures. People can also experience trauma from, being labeled as drug-seeking, attention-seeking, blamed for their actions or their circumstances, devalued, disrespected, and treated without dignity. And so when you look at the combination of that, a place that is supposed to be and sort of brands itself as being safe and prioritizing safety, respect, dignity, these types of words that are often used, and then people have an experience that is very much not that. That can actually be a more complex type of trauma for some people, and where that dissonance between something that is in our society and in the institution claimed to be safe, and then people's experience of it is that it's anything but. And that can certainly be very difficult for folks to reconcile and very difficult for others to actually validate because their experience may be, well, the health system is where I got better, or I received really compassionate care. So that can certainly be at odds with these experiences of trauma that are rooted in health experiences. So it's important to be aware of that. So we see this impact of trauma throughout life in areas that are often very far removed from the trauma itself. And so that can be very challenging for folks to actually wrap their heads around, is the trauma happened over here and I'm seeing effects over here. And so, people who experienced abuse, often the logical sort of extension of that is, a man abused you, therefore you are afraid of men, and men trigger you and sort of stir up your trauma. That can certainly happen, and it does happen. However, trauma doesn't actually follow nice, neat rules like that often, and people can see effects in places that are seemingly unrelated to their root trauma, and it can show up in all sorts of places in the body, in the brain, in our relationships, and folks really sometimes need a lot of support to actually understand this. Our role in a trauma-informed approach isn't necessarily to dig deep into that and sort out what's the connection between what happened and what you're experiencing now, but it's to understand that what we're seeing today may be caused by or initiated because of an experience that was very, very far removed from what we're experiencing right now. So one of the things, of course, that many of us know is when trauma isn't addressed, it isn't acknowledged, it isn't validated, people in distress may struggle and often do struggle to care for themselves and for others. So they may end up with lots of health issues, mental health and physical health. They may find themselves struggling to parent or to be a caregiver. They may struggle in intimate partnerships. And these things, of course, often bring them into the world of health and social services. And so we see so many variations of trauma in a day, and I would say most of the time, aren't necessarily thinking trauma first. And a trauma-informed approach really asks us to do that and see, through the behavior, through the struggle, through the pain, and actually think about what's behind this. We may never know the answer to that question, but to actually just reflect on the question. And so when we think about the effects of trauma, we see, of course, increased types of stress physically and mentally. That can look like a variety of things. One of the most interesting things is the research is evolving to talk about things like the impact of chronic stress on the immune system. And so people may find their immune system is compromised, and they may actually then be more susceptible to a variety of illnesses because of that. People may have just a generally decreased stress tolerance where it doesn't seem to take much to send them into that sort of state of distress. We see lots of conflict in relationships, often generalized decreased trust, including trust in oneself, and that may manifest in a variety of ways. But a couple interesting things I just want to touch on quickly. Hyperarousal, hypervigilance. This is one that if you haven't taken any trauma training, might be new. So hyperarousal, hypervigilance basically means folks go into a state where their body and their brain are interpreting their environment as dangerous, potentially life-threatening, and goes into this state of hyperarousal and hypervigilance where they may be on alert almost all the time. It's a very exhausting state to be in, and typically is designed to be a temporary state, right, that we go into periodically when there's a perception of danger. And so our brains become very, very aware of our physical surroundings and the environment, very, very perceptive of people coming and going, of how to escape spaces, and so on. And so for some folks, they can go into a sustained state of hypervigilance, where their brain is perceiving danger in their environment almost always, and they may become very, very difficult to settle, difficult to self-regulate emotionally, difficult to be present in an environment because they're constantly scanning for, entrances, exits, trying to read how people feel to them, whether they feel safe, whether there's a threat there. So they may be expending a lot of mental and physical energy and missing out on emotional connection because they're constantly in this state of hypervigilance. Hyperarousal, somewhat related, but certainly often looks like folks who are very, very emotionally aroused. So in this state where their bodies, their brains, their emotions are basically always in a state of instability of sorts, easily triggered, very difficult to self-regulate often. The other thing I want to touch on is rigid and chaotic behavior. And again, these tend to be extremes, and a lot of folks are somewhere between the two. But one of the things we tend to see in folks with trauma histories is they may develop different coping mechanisms to control their environment. Hypervigilance is one way of trying to do that. Rigid and chaotic behavior is another example of this. And so folks who go really rigid may be experienced by others as controlling or not very adaptable or flexible about things like making plans or organizing work or running a household. So rigidity, though, it's not always bad. People can sort of take this way of adapting to trauma and distress, needing to control their environment, and actually use that to be really, really organized in their work, very, very detail-oriented, those types of things. They may not forget things easily. That's also a sign of hypervigilance. They remember perhaps details that others didn't even notice. And those things can actually be used to one's benefit. They aren't always negative. The downside is often if that is coming from a place of needing to try to seek control, it's almost impossible in those moments for people to stop doing that. It's not just a choice. It's a brain that is saying, we can't trust this situation, this person, this environment. Therefore, the only way we can be in it and survive is to actually be in control and be very, very rigid about what we will accept and how we do that, which is a very exhausting way to be. It also can be very, very difficult relationally when that rigidity becomes a barrier between connecting or barrier to connecting with others. Then we have folks on the other end of the spectrum who may be quite chaotic, and so this may be where we see folks who engage in substance use or very erratic behavior, impulsive behavior, and it's essentially that sort of, I can't gain control over a situation, so I'm not even going to try, and in fact I'm going to let go and allow things to happen to me, or just go with the flow. This, again, isn't all bad. People who can thrive in chaos actually can be quite adaptable, and that can be very helpful in a variety of workplaces. They may do really well in fast-paced work environments. They may be able to shift gears in a project or the course of work very, very quickly, and those things may be actually quite helpful. They may be able to just kind of go with it in relationships. The challenge, though, is these folks may struggle to really feel like they're present. They may really, really have a hard time settling down emotionally or physically. So this may be, people who move a lot or change jobs a lot, because that sense of rootedness or being grounded is very distressing and uncomfortable for them. So when we think about common trauma responses, most people are quite familiar with fight and flight. Some people have probably heard of freeze. And there's some scholars and authors, researchers on trauma talk about the fawn or flop response as well. And so I'll go through all four. So fight and flight are pretty self-explanatory. So this is basically the orientation of our brain and our nervous system to responding to that sense of threat, that sense of, threat to life and limb, and it may be triggered in seemingly unrelated circumstances or, out of context. And so fight, these folks tend to be oriented towards fighting their way out of a situation. So that can be through things like anger and aggression. They may become defensive. They may be quite agitated, or they may be really suspicious of others. And those are just some examples of it. Folks who go into flight mode tend to leave, or they just avoid things altogether so they don't ever get there, so they don't have to leave. And that is the sort of core strategy of coping for those folks is avoidance. That can look like a variety of things, substance use, so numbing out. For some people, it shows up as suicidal ideation. That doesn't mean that other trauma responses are not related to or don't include folks who express suicidal ideation. But people who experience a flight response, often that sort of desire to leave, escape, flee a situation, this is the ultimate flight, is suicide. And so there may be a greater risk, and so it may be important to be aware of that and perhaps even be openly discussing that. Anxiety shows up. You may also see folks with lots of no-shows, and that may be that avoidance, that sense of I just can't go there. I don't know that that place is going to be safe. And then we have the freeze folks. So these are people who just shut down. So they may be prone to things like depression. They may sleep a lot. They may not sleep at all. They may struggle with connection, show lots of overwhelm, despondency. This group is believed to have, dissociate perhaps more than others because that is that sort of shutting down, although dissociation can also be associated with a flight response. So that sense that somebody is just sort of leaving the situation, maybe not physically, but their brain, their nervous system, their emotional connection is just sort of elsewhere. And dissociation, contrary to popular belief, isn't this really obvious or very, very dramatic sense of, floating above one's body or being in a different place. Dissociation can be really, really subtle, and people can be very functional while dissociating. So one example that people often use when we talk about what does dissociation feel like is if you've ever been driving somewhere and you all of a sudden have this realization that you don't remember driving the last several minutes. And you know you were driving because you still are, but you have no recollection of how you got to where you are. That can be sort of like what dissociation feels like for some folks. But dissociation is really a technique that people use to kind of separate themselves, create a buffer between themselves and a situation that may be distressing or may be triggering trauma. And then this fawn or flop response, some scholars don't talk about this much and others do. So this is an interesting trauma response in that this group of folks tend to seek safety not by shutting down, leaving, or fighting, but by trying to influence the others who are in their world, whether that's at work, at home, out in community. They try to seek safety by manipulating or influencing the state of others around them. And so if others around them are happy, settled, and calm, they can then feel calm. And so, of course, having one sense of safety be completely at the mercy, controlled by others, essentially, is a very, very challenging way to live. But these folks develop fairly strong skills at persuasion, negotiating. They often may be seen as peacekeepers, but they can also be salesmen, read the situation really well, know how to sort of fit in that. They can often be caregivers as well. And so when we think about the fawn or flop response, this tends to be that I'll go wherever you go, or I'll do whatever you want, because that will keep you happy, which will keep me settled. So there's that I'll do whatever you need for now to get my needs met, which can create some real challenges in relationships, of course. So this is a sort of an interesting perspective on this that can be really, really helpful. So in terms of a takeaway, this could be one of those takeaways, is trauma compromises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. So instead of engaging with the world in ways that help us connect more, trauma actually then feeds those patterns that developed in that initial trauma or the ongoing trauma, our experience of trauma, in ways that mean we prioritize, our brain and our nervous system prioritize protection over connection. That doesn't mean we don't connect. It means that connection looks different. It often happens differently, and it can require some different techniques to actually make connection possible that may not be experienced by everyone. So if you're interested in learning more about that, Dana, who's a social worker, writes quite a bit about polyvagal theory and the clinical setting, and is highly recommended as an author, alongside folks like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk. But she's sort of got some interesting writing specifically about these sort of patterns of connection, patterns of protection, and how those play out for people. So I've mentioned a couple times sort of coping, and this is what happens as people adapt. Their brains, their nervous systems, their bodies, their relationships, they adapt. And so people will develop strategies to cope with the uncomfortable sense of feeling unsafe in the world, unsafe in a relationship with others, unsafe in particular spaces. So people will develop strategies to manage that, and those strategies sometimes serve them very well and other times less so, although I would argue that survival skills, coping strategies in the moment are typically the best a person can do given what they have available to them. So when we think about self-harm, yeah, the ideal would be people didn't do that. However, it's one outlet for people to process emotional and sort of trauma-related feelings, right? So if people can engage in that, we can take a harm reduction approach to self-harm and really look at, okay, people are self-harming, how do we minimize the harm that could come from that long-term? And certainly one of the things that we also see is people who avoid triggers, so they may avoid healthcare settings, or they may avoid, maybe school is really hard, maybe certain spaces or types of people or smells. So people may become very good at learning how to avoid, which means that that's what's running their life, right, is avoidance of triggers, not I want to go to this place. Usually I want to go to this place, but my concern is I will meet someone who triggers me, or that space may trigger me, or I don't know, therefore it's not safe to take the risk. And so people develop the strategy of avoiding those spaces that they think may be triggering or have been triggering in the past. We also see things like disordered eating, substance use. All of these are used to usually seek control, and people will maybe numb out as a way of sort of taking control over distressing feelings. Disordered eating, controlling the body literally. So these types of behaviors and sort of strategies are really quite adaptive, creative ways that people come up with to manage the discomfort and distress that are associated with the long-term effects of trauma. Of course, we know these things are often pathologized, labeled, misunderstood. And so another takeaway from this session, unresolved trauma trumps logic every single time. So people are triggered. They are not capable of logical thought, reasoning out actions, making decisions. They may be able to go through the motions and appear that they are, but if somebody is in a trauma state, acute trauma, their nervous system, their brain isn't allowing that. It goes into that survival mode where it isn't spending the time to reason out the consequences of one action or versus another. That is not the priority. It's act quickly to survive. And so even if we can't see what the danger would be that would be triggering someone into this sort of survival mode, we also, though, know from neuroscience, understanding human relationships, the tons of stories of trauma survivors, that when people are in that state, they're not thinking logically. So the expectation that people can self-regulate, that people can think through consequences, that people can follow rules, act on prior experiences, do what they're asked, isn't reasonable. So when we see people go into these states, we may not know what's happening, for starters. So usually what I recommend is if you are interacting with someone or someone's telling you about a situation and their actions seem quite illogical, I usually assume that trauma might be an ingredient in that situation. If people aren't able to think through consequences, they're not able to act on requests from others or instructions or rules, or they're just not able to sort of move through a situation in a sort of reasonable way, relatively, I always ask what the trauma happening, what's going on with trauma right now. And that has been very helpful because it means I get less frustrated that why aren't you listening to me? Why did you do that? So particularly folks in frontline situations, I do a lot of work with people who work in emergency rooms, and this comes up a lot is, well, why would they do that? That made no sense and it actually made things worse. That to me is quite likely got a bit of trauma going on there, where someone was traumatized, they were triggered, probably by environment, people, situation, variety of things, and unable to reason out, okay, if I do this, it will actually hurt me more, it will limit my access to care, or, not serve me. And that's such a crucial piece, I think, for folks to remember. So if we aren't thinking trauma-informed and we see these survival strategies or these coping tools people develop, we start to pathologize, diagnose. That may have its place, but there are quite a few accounts and some research to support that when we label and diagnose people, we may actually be setting folks on a path where their trauma doesn't get addressed, because then it becomes about treating their illness, which may be helpful to them, and that is absolutely true. And it may also be that if their trauma was addressed, their symptoms may improve, may actually resolve. And so what happens in our systems, though, is that people get set on a course where you have bipolar disorder, we're going to treat you for bipolar disorder, and we understand that in a particular way about brain chemistry and a variety of things, which is fine, but that model of understanding doesn't include an acknowledgement of how the impact of trauma can actually look like bipolar disorder. And if we attended to the trauma, would it change the symptoms? Would that person still meet the threshold for diagnosis of that disorder? Maybe, maybe not. Most of the time we don't get an opportunity to actually, let's try this and see. Or let's try trauma therapy and conventional treatment, psychiatric treatment, and see whether we can manage, perhaps not saying people would be off meds and those types of things, but I believe, and the research supports this, that this would make a difference in people's self-concept, in the way they're perceived by others, in the way they move through the world, in the way health providers perceive them and treat them, but also in the treatment options that were provided, the pathways that people are on. And so it's really, really crucial, though, that people's adaptive survival skills and strategies are understood as that they may be coming from a different place, or there may be more to it than what we often see. So we may end up misdiagnosing, and this isn't just mental health. And in fact, I would say the research supports that it's more often the physical health concerns that are misdiagnosed, because on occasion people will develop pretty severe physical manifestations of trauma with no apparent illness, injury, or pathology that's at the root of those physical health concerns, and often spend a lot of time, energy searching for an answer. Why do I feel this way? And in the process, because there, may not be an underlying cause that, our traditional medical model can name, they may be labeled as hypochondriac, attention-seeking, drug-seeking. All sorts of negative labels are attached to that, which is not helpful for people. And in fact, people then may feel they're making it up. It's all in their head, which ironically, when it comes to trauma stuff, it kind of is, because the origin of their pain, their physical distress, is nervous system malfunction, right? Adaptation that isn't serving them well physically. And the solution to that, we can certainly maybe manage physical symptoms, but the solution would be work on the trauma stuff and develop different coping strategies. Will that make the physical manifestation disappear? Not necessarily. Sometimes bodies adapt in ways that can't necessarily just be stopped or disrupted in that way, where people see, oh, my stomach pain disappeared, but they may see dramatic improvement. And for some people, that improvement comes quite quickly when they realize there is a reason they feel this way, and that can be very liberating. So, of course, if we're thinking about things as purely physical illness or a mental illness, and we're not accommodating for the role of trauma in developing survival skills or coping strategies, we may actually end up, inappropriate or not really adequate referrals or treatment plans, those sorts of things. And so we may be missing critical pieces of the puzzle that really means we're never quite getting there when it comes to our approach to working with folks. And of course, then people may end up feeling like they're not heard or seen or validated, or even they're blamed for their experiences. And, there's the sense that you're doing this. to yourself. So stop doing that and you'll feel better. And often I think the root of that response comes from this place of frustration that we have tried everything that we can think of in our traditional model to respond to what this, person is bringing to us in terms of distress, and none of it is actually adequate. Therefore, it must be this person. And the reality is it's a brain that is hurting, a body and a person that are hurting. And that isn't about someone who's making things up or seeking attention. They are seeking attention because they are in distress and need support. So what can we do about this? One model of trauma-informed care talks about the 4 R's. And so these are, realize that trauma is far more widespread than any of us probably were ever trained to understand. And so reconfigure our understanding of what trauma is, what counts, and actually get rid of the whole idea that we can decide what counts and what doesn't, because that response isn't something that's predictable, and it isn't in the sense that we can create these really narrow definitions or these really specific sort of check sheets of what counts as trauma. The reality is, as I said earlier, it's not about what happened, it's about what happens after and what happens inside. And so that is something that is not chosen. It is not in the control of the person who's experiencing it. And so the outcome of that, the impact of that is something that can't be constrained to these tiny definitions of what counts as trauma. So if people experience it and it looks like trauma, it's trauma. And so then we need to get better at recognizing those signs and symptoms. So people who are going into fight, flight, freeze, or flop, people who are struggling in relationships and at the root of their struggle may be issues of feeling unsafe or not trusting, and behind that may be a trauma experience or a trauma response. And so being able to actually see things differently and ask ourselves, could this be trauma, knowing full well we may not be able to get the answer to that question, but that we can adjust our approach regardless. And then so responding from a trauma-informed perspective. And one thing I will mention is people often emphasize the trauma-informed practice piece. So practitioners, service providers of various trainings who are providing a different type of care. That's great. However, we need trauma-informed organizations that set procedures, policies, and that approach workers and the people who are accessing services differently. That is going to take a very long time. And so there seems to be lots of willingness to help frontline staff be more trauma-informed, which is great. Less sort of excitement about let's go through policies and talk about how our policies may be actually creating space where trauma isn't addressed or trauma can happen. So being able to actually do the organization level work is really the challenge around the trauma-informed stuff. And bottom line, if we can just stop re-traumatizing people, we will be making some progress. Not true trauma-informed progress, but if we can become more aware of the impact of our actions as service providers on the people who are accessing service and better understand their response to that so that we can hopefully not become another source of trauma for people, that is in and of itself a good thing. So the approach that a lot of folks advocate with trauma-informed care is universal precautions. And so those of you who've worked in sort of more clinical or acute care settings in health probably have heard this before. This is often talked about in terms of how, frontline healthcare providers like nurses, they put gloves on for everybody. They don't just put gloves on with people they know have an infectious disease. That's a pretty concrete example, right? So this idea that doing so not only means they are protecting themselves and others regardless of whether we know there's a potential for risk, they're actually doing that for everybody. It also reduces the stigma that we don't just glove and gown and, take these extraordinary precautions with some people. We take those with everyone. So it normalizes the practice. And so with trauma, what that looks like is assume trauma is present for everybody. Don't ask, have you experienced trauma, unless you are a trauma specialist or have access to folks who do trauma-specific work. So you don't have to ask, and people don't need to tell you. They may choose to tell you, and that's different than being asked and then people feeling they must tell you or they must decide whether they can tell you. And that is really, really critical to trauma-informed approaches, that that disclosure isn't required. We don't need to know. We can adapt our approach to everybody, and it won't cause harm to people who don't have a trauma history, but it will benefit people who have experienced trauma. It may actually benefit everybody. So when we think about the principles of trauma-informed care, these are often things that many of us think we're already doing. So compassionate and person-centered care, absolutely. Lots of workplaces, organizations actually claim that approach, that is the heart of what they do is person-centered care. And then, of course, that care is compassionate. I would say push yourself. If you think you're person-centered and compassionate, probably are, be more compassionate. Dig deep. Let's see how much more person-centered we can become. And that is an interesting challenge because it may require us to get creative, to think differently about people who don't show up for appointments or programs, people we don't see at all, and really ask some critical questions of ourselves in our work. Safety and trustworthiness, again, often I think most of us are striving to be experienced as safe and trustworthy in terms of the work we do. This is crucial when we're thinking about trauma because trauma, of course, disrupts for folks that sense of safety and trust. And so we need to work really, really hard to reestablish that. That may mean we need to prioritize building safety and establishing trust over other things. And that can be really tough in systems and services where we have limited time with people or limited capacity to see folks as much as they need to be seen. Or maybe we don't have the services that are exactly what people need. So then how do you navigate that? And it's a tough, I don't have an easy answer to that question. But whenever possible, how do we prioritize that sense of safety and trustworthiness? Choice and collaboration are really, really critical as well. And so this is this idea that whenever possible, how can we offer a choice to this person? Trauma often involves people feeling like they lost control. They didn't have control over what was happening to them. And so offering choice, functioning in a collaborative way in a relationship is about fostering that sense of control, helping people feel they have some say in what's happening to them right now. Really, really critical cornerstone to healing from trauma. And so even if you're not doing trauma-specific work, this approach may be part of people's healing experience, right? So if you're offering choice, it doesn't have to be the big choices because we may have limitations on what choices we can offer. It doesn't mean the choices are gone. So it may be things as simple as, would you like to sit there or there? Maybe it's, would you like the door open a crack or would you like it closed? Would you like to meet with me in the morning or the afternoon? These are all choices that many of us can make and offer quite easily, right? We just often don't think to do it. It's not how some folks, maybe that's how you already work, but there are lots of places in systems that people encounter that just say, the next opening we have is at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, I've scheduled you in. And people then have to say no or yes to that, which if you're in, sort of navigating a trauma response, being able to have a choice first can establish that sense of control or maintain it for folks who are struggling with that. So it can also just feel good for everybody. Do you prefer to meet with your counselor at 9 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon. Some people are struggling with sleep. A 9 a.m. may never happen for them. And so are we offering choice? And if we can't offer that choice, what other choices can we make? Then looking at how do we talk about empowerment, are we strengths-based? Because often, you know, as I've said, people's coping strategies are misunderstood, pathologized, framed in a very negative way, and people are told to either stop that or sometimes those are, you know, avoiding those things are conditions of getting kids back from care or not going to jail. And when we think about this from a trauma-informed perspective, we start saying, oh my God, we're expecting people to give up the thing that they feel is keeping them alive. What are they going to choose? Are they going to be able to choose at all? And so when we think about strengths-based, being able to reframe those coping strategies is just that. You were doing the best you could with what you had. You kept yourself alive. That's amazing. And that's often, you know, where we're naturally inclined to go with this stuff. But really, really emphasizing that for people because those behaviors are so often seen as problematic and negative. And then, of course, adding in a layer of cultural humility and cultural safety. So when we're working with folks interculturally, so cultures other than our own, particularly Indigenous folks who have experienced collectively and individually a history riddled with oppression, genocide, and people who were supposed to be caring for them doing something so far from that. That sense of trust is a very, very, very hard one. And so being able to understand that cultural safety is another layer of that experience of safety for some folks. And then that includes understanding the power we have as practitioners and the history that brings people to us collectively and personally. So when we look at how that translates to our actual work, I've given some examples, but that can look like changing or questioning how our environment looks. Perhaps we have, you know, some power to change how our office is laid out, how our waiting area is structured. Maybe there'll be an opportunity down the road to look at some of those things, right? If we're repainting our space or we're needing to purchase new lighting, are we making decisions that are moving us closer to a trauma-informed approach? And in the tools and resources at the end of this slide deck, there's a really, really good resource, actually Canadian, that provides some concrete guidance around trauma-informed physical environments. So looking at everything from your reception area, your workspace, how can those things become more trauma-informed? But ultimately, we're looking at how do we understand safety in physical environments? How do we create environments that are warm and welcoming and friendly, which can create that foundation for safe and trustworthy relationships? Then, of course, our work is relationship-focused, collaborative, compassionate. So really thinking about how do we take a more relational approach to our work, which is often more culturally responsive as well, because, of course, that relational approach tends to be in better alignment with Indigenous worldview and with other worldviews as well. Transparency, consistency, and predictability are part of trustworthiness. So that ability to say, yeah, I can do that, and then do it, or if we can't, to be upfront about that. And as much as possible, provide some context about how that came to be, why, what's the policy, what's the limitation, those types of things. And that can be really uncomfortable sometimes, but I think it's really, really crucial. People, especially who are experiencing hypervigilance, may get really good at reading whether people are holding something back, whether they're not telling the full truth, whether our assurances are indeed to be trusted. And so being able to commit to transparency, consistency, and predictability is really, really key. Flexibility, choice, control. So this is that offering choices, being more collaborative. So perhaps this is saying, hey, do you want to meet outside today? Do you, is there a way we can be more flexible in the way we offer services? Is there a way we can share some of the power and control in our relationship? This also, though, includes a very, very strong emphasis on our own self-awareness, our self-care, our wellness as providers. And so we need to be, as best as we can, attentive to our own needs, particularly if we have a history of trauma. And of course, many of us in this work do. So how does that actually show up? And are we self-regulating? Are we able to sort of ride out the stuff that may come when we're sitting with people who are traumatized as well? And also a culture of mutual learning, respect, teaching, sharing. So seeing the people we support as very, very crucial to our own understanding of our work and the world, to having valuable knowledge and experiences they can share with us, and being open to learning from that. It may also require us to consider our comfort with self-disclosure, because mutuality requires that two-way street. So in order for people to trust us, they may need to feel they know us a little bit. And so that then may take us into a place that we have to really think through, how comfortable am I disclosing? What's appropriate for me to share? And why am I sharing? Am I sharing for, the betterment of this relationship and something that's in the best interest of this person? Am I sharing because I'm really struggling now and I need someone to hear me, and I think this person will hear me? So really being mindful of that, but also reflecting on it. So just as a recap, if you wanted to distill all of that down into 3 points, focus on safety, choice and control, and connection. Those 3 things are really the heart of trauma-informed care. And so if we can be thinking and filtering our actions, our environment, our programs through those layers, we will be naturally leaning towards more trauma-informed care approaches. So another sort of helpful takeaway, instead of thinking what's wrong with this person, what happened to this person? And so if we're looking for a diagnosis, this is particularly helpful, but also if we're frustrated or struggling to connect with somebody. And we may not literally be saying to them, what's wrong with you? We may think some version of that in our head, though. Like, why aren't you doing what you need to do? This is not that hard. Or we kind of had a plan and you aren't following through. So if we're in those moments of frustration, or maybe we're just struggling to figure it out, it can be helpful reminder to go back to this touchstone of what happened to this person, that this is their functioning, this is the way they relate to me, this is the way they relate to others, and this is why they make the decisions they make. And reframing those things again as coping strategies, survival skills that may not be serving them particularly well in the moment, but that's their call, right? Is it still serving me well? And for some people, they have a realization when that question is sort of put to them, oh, not really, actually, that's why I'm here, or that's part of why I'm here, is I don't want to function like this anymore. I want to develop new coping strategies, and that's often our job. So the other reminder is that all behavior is communication. So we often have heard that, but getting that back into sort of our layers of reflection when we're working with folks takes on particular meaning with people with trauma histories, right? What is this person trying to tell me, or what are you trying to tell your family through that particular strategy or behavior? And can be a useful one for folks. The other one that has proven really helpful is people are often like, why can't I do this, right? But that's often coming to a place of why won't I, that I have a choice. and I am making the wrong choice over and over again, very often, and helping people understand that in these moments, this is neurobiology stuff, right? This is a brain that's saying, whoa, this is not safe, and we are going on to survival mode now. And so it's not that we won't and we're making poor choices. It may be that we can't, which may be tough for people to accept. And I've worked with parents who really, really struggle with this one, with their kids. With your kids got a trauma history, and in that moment, they actually cannot do what you're needing them to do. And you need to be, as a parent, able to support them through that until they're in a situation where they're grounded, regulated, and then able to actually make decisions about what they're doing, or able to respond to requests or follow rules or whatever it is. And so that can be a really crucial one. So one of the things you may have noticed in this slide deck is all of the images include water. This comes from a young woman that I worked with quite some time ago who talked about her experience of trauma. As she talked about standing at the beach, at the ocean, and that the water would lap against her feet, and it was okay. It was actually sometimes nice. But then sometimes the waves would get higher, and the waves would challenge her balance, and she'd have to work harder just to stand there. And then sometimes those waves actually came and they just rolled her, sometimes without even knowing it was coming at her. And that she would get disoriented, struggle, and start to panic instantly. And had this sense, she's like, I would go instantly from this state of I'm standing here in the water and it's nice to, oh my God, I'm drowning. And she would talk about this as if, it happened so quickly she didn't even know how she got from one place to another. And that then when she was in that state of thinking she was drowning, her actions were completely oriented towards survival. And she said often she would realize once the sort of wave went back out, the tide, starts to abate a little bit, that she could just put her feet down on the sand and stand up. That she wasn't getting swept out to sea most of the time, and that she could be okay. But in that state of panic, logic wasn't on her side, so that can you touch the bottom isn't even occurring to her. So this is very much what that state is like. Not won't, can't, right? Her brain wasn't saying, let's reason through some options right now. It was saying, flail to the top, the surface, because you need to breathe, and we're dying right now. So when people are in a acute sort of triggered trauma state, this is often what it feels like. And it can come up very, very quickly. It can take someone's feet out from under them that fast. And then they're not in that state of reasoning out what's happening. So I'm going to wind down talking a bit about when trauma comes to work. And for many of us, our work is supporting people with trauma experiences. However, many of us also have our own trauma stories, and those may be from early life, may have happened at different points in time. Maybe they've been workplace-acquired trauma where we've experienced vicarious trauma, or we've been part of violent incidents. So there's a variety of aspects of trauma stories, but we work in trauma-saturated environments where trauma is just there all the time. Even if we're not seeing people as clients in the moment, we are often sitting in the staff room with people with trauma history, or in a staff meeting, or in supervision with people with trauma stories, and of course often carrying our own trauma stories. And these can create conditions where we are more vulnerable to things like compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, burnout as well. If we're working in trauma-saturated environments and we have our own trauma story, we can be drawing on our coping strategies all the time, and are more likely to sort of burn out more quickly and more vulnerable to things like vicarious trauma. So it's really, really crucial that we engage in conversations in our workplaces, especially for managers and directors and folks, about how are we responding to this reality that trauma is in our workplaces every single day. And so, of course, if we're working with people who are experiencing suffering, loss, trauma, it will impact us. This is not well, for some people they'll be affected. Everyone is affected differently, but they're affected. And so this is a reasonable expectation and a natural consequence of being exposed to the kind of pain that we witness every single day in our work. We also witness joy and beauty and a variety of other things. But in the midst of that is often a very, very clear thread of pain, trauma, suffering, loss that does have an impact on us. It may be a positive impact, but it does affect us. And so our workplaces have a responsibility to acknowledge that and then look at how they function. And one of the things is if workers get traumatized, whether that's because of work or because of things that happen outside of work, they can impact our ability to relate to others, our ability to keep showing up for work, our ability to reason out problems, manage change. All sorts of things are affected by that. And so it's in the interest of employers to address trauma in the workplace. It's in the interest of employees, but especially in the interest of the people we're there to support. Because if we're traumatized, we aren't going to be doing our best work. And the risk of re-traumatizing people who are coming in for service increases, right? And we don't want to do that. So trauma-informed workplaces prioritize support for staff, whether that's through supervision, access to EAP programs, normalizing the practice of taking time away from work, those types of things, but also offering ongoing learning opportunities, and I would say as broad a range of learning as we can. Some people's learning is going to be going and getting their certification in somatic experiencing, which is directly benefiting the people we work with. That's awesome. Others, though, maybe their ongoing learning is going to trauma-informed yoga training, which may not be seen as directly relevant to our workplace and may actually then be at great risk of not being approved for time off and, professional development funds and so on. And so that's one of the challenges that comes from trauma-informed care is how do we actually think about the needs of workers as much as we think about the needs of people accessing service, and how do we actually understand the ongoing development of workers as humans who are exposed to great amounts of pain, suffering, trauma, and therefore who need a variety of types of learning and development. The other piece that workers need is trauma-informed supervision and mentorship. And so there are very specific things that supervisors, managers can do that come from that place of trauma-informed principles in terms of how we interact. So when we're seeing staff who are struggling, who are engaging in conflict, who are not responding to change well, who are burnt out, or who are maybe just rule breakers all over the place, can we understand these in a trauma-informed way, right? That these may be coping strategies for folks. This may be an adaptation that is born out of an experience of trauma, and people may be triggered in their workplace. Then what do you do? That's the challenging part. But the first step to that is actually recognizing it and being able to not see, oh, well, here's another know-it-all who thinks they know more than everybody else, who wants to control everyone in the workplace. And that often change, loss, uncertainty triggers this stuff, right? So when we think about the big systems many of us work in, near constant change. that certainly will, for some people, trigger those coping strategies, and they may not be the most helpful or functional in terms of promoting a healthy work environment. It's also, though, about looking at our policies, our processes, our programs, and thinking, okay, how do these foster a culture of self-care, resilience on the part of workers? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, I think we're doing okay. And there's some really good resources at the end of the slide deck that will actually provide some more depth about what that can look like for folks. And then the last piece is just acknowledging staff trauma, no matter where it came from, when it happened. You don't need to know that, just like with clients, right? We don't need to ask. We don't need a disclosure. We might get it. And then we respond with compassion and empathy and understanding and validation. But acknowledging it's a thing, talking about it openly is important, and not just when there's been a critical incident. I think, yes, then, of course, but talking about this as just an everyday thing. Talk about it in group supervision, individual supervision, staff meetings, planning sessions. This should be part of our conversation, is we work in a place where there's lots of trauma, and that includes trauma on the part of the workers. So what does that mean for us? And again, some really good Canadian resources, one at a BC, one at a Manitoba, that really provide great guidance on what organizations can do to better support staff, which means they will better be able to support the folks who are coming in to access services. So some thoughts just as we wrap up to think about, how do I contribute to a trauma-informed workplace? And so am I still optimistic that people can recover? Do I believe people can change, including my coworkers and myself? Do I believe people are good or bad? And these things may seem unrelated, but really what it is a check on sort of our general orientation of the world, which can help us have some awareness if we're starting to stray from that, which is a sign that trauma is creeping in. Do you know what your triggers are? And you may not know them all, and you may learn new ones sometimes, but in general, we can develop a pretty good awareness of what is it that's tough for us and sets us off, makes it tougher to regulate, what are the situations, the people, and we can't anticipate all of them, but we can certainly have some awareness of what might be some of those hot spots. Can you actually self-regulate? And that is really, really crucial. Can you help others do the same? And how do you contribute to a compassionate workplace? And what can you do to advocate for yourself and your colleagues to get what they need to be trauma-informed? And this may be the real sort of core piece of work that needs to happen, is the practice maybe, sort of heading in the direction of trauma-informed, or maybe totally there. But then how is that sustainable? You may be fighting against some policies, or you may need some other resources or supports to continue doing work that way. Where's the advocacy need? And it may just be, how do we get the rest of the system to work this way so we're not sort of an island for folks, and then they go out and experience not great care in other areas of the system. So you can probably think, as we go through examples, sometimes people are coming up with the concerns. This isn't going to work great with this clientele or this program. That's okay. You're welcome to fire those my way, and I will do my best to help you navigate that. And I'm always really interested to hear, how are people applying this, or where's the struggle in finding the alignment. And as I said, there's some really great resources at the end of the slide deck. I encourage you to follow up on them. Some of them are really quick videos. Some of them are really involved program guides or practice guides. If you would like more resources about trauma-informed approaches, I have so much more than what's available and posted on the slide deck. So please let me know. You're welcome to sort of look me up, fire me an email, give me a call. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, I would love to hear from you. I'm also available to do a bit of consultation within the Health Authority on trauma-informed responses. And so if you're developing a program, evaluating a program, or looking at a particular situation and would like a different perspective, you're welcome to reach out and connect with me. So thanks for hanging out a bit today, and I hope you found some information was relevant and helpful in your work.